It is a truism around the world, in every country, that the future of the world economy depends above all on technological progress. As we go from, for example, fossil fuels to electric automobiles, as we go from one kind of transportation to another, from one kind of medical care to a more advanced, more capable medical care. We need trained, educated people. That will determine the future of the American economy much more than where the location of our next factory is, whether it's in Mexico or the United States. It is silly to be focused, for example, on moving factories, a difficult, risky, long-term project, while we get rid of our educational institutions. And make no mistake, what you're watching on the federal level is similar to what is happening in many of the states of the United States. The White House, when celebrating the Supreme Court's decision, said it wants to give the power of education to the states. Yeah, but the states don't have the resources the federal government does. The states are focused, logically, on the state. But the state's objectives are different from that of the federal government. That's why we have a federal government. That's why every other country has. And while I'm talking about other countries, let me drive home the point, not that it should be needed, but in the People's Republic of China, they are spending more each year on education, not less. They are building schools and building colleges left and right. You know, until a few decades ago, basically until World War II, we had a level of higher education that was split between public and private. Private were most of the colleges and universities. Public were what we called land-grant institutions. They were colleges and universities basically to set up to help farmers, to help the rural agricultural people with important training of farmers and helping farmers understand fertilizer and chemistry and all the rest of it. Only after World War II did the American working class make a fundamental demand on this society. We want our kids to get college educations also. And you know who they turned to do that? The federal government. It stepped in to help finance all the state universities. But it was a federal and state partnership, as it has remained ever since. Today, 3/4 of our college students go to a public governmental institution. If you pull away the federal government's role, you leave it to the states, they're not going to be able to sustain it, and it means you're diminishing your commitment to education. Why in the world? What crazy logic would make you do that at this juncture in this country's history? It's because you don't want to spend the money. You already don't tax the super rich the way you once did. You do not tax corporations anything like what we did as recently as 30 and 40 years ago. You've given them the biggest tax breaks they ever got. So boasts Mr. Trump. So why, if you're not willing to tax them, do you add insult to the injury for the mass of people by destroying it and putting in charge of the education department a woman who's rich on the basis of wrestling? That's saying you don't care. You don't mind what happens. You don't want any agency of the government to be committed to adjusting and developing and improving education. It's not going to happen by itself, and it's not going to happen if you insult the entire educational community, teachers, students, parents, by this disrespectful slashing of a budget. It is a sign of a society disintegrating in terms of the institutions that ought to be helping it hold together. When the American empire and the American capitalist system was on the way up, We can start, as most people do about that, with the Civil War. At that period, the middle of the 19th century, that it was understood that in order to sustain the upward growth that everyone wanted to see, especially when the Civil War was over, you needed to educate people. So we had a big fight in the United States to create the public school system. That's what we did. And conservatives were against it. But everybody else, including the mass of working people, saw it as a way forward for the country, for the economy, and for themselves and their children. So we fought and we got, over opposition, a public school system. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we fought after the Second World War to give the mass of the working class college educations. And since they were unaffordable in the private schools, we had to create the state university and the state college and the community college systems. That is where overwhelming majority of Americans get their education. The government was crucial in these two breakthroughs. So what in the world do you conclude that we're now at a point where we're not expanding educational opportunities, expanding our commitment to education, which served us so well for the last century and a half? We're cutting it? We're getting rid of it? What? What kind of social nutsiness are we talking about here? This is not consistent with our own experience. And then when we come to the college student, debt of our students, that was a horrific thing. You know, back after the Russians beat us to space, back in the 1950s with Sputnik, the original man in space, and the Russians did it first, it led to an immense conversation in the United States. And the 50s and 60s were times of rapid economic growth of the American economy, much more rapid than now. What was decided was we had made a mistake. We hadn't emphasized education. And we passed something called the National Defense Education Act, which created a vast army, you guessed it, of scholarships and fellowships to help students afford higher education. And it was understood to subsidize universities opening their doors to a whole new generation of young people who could now afford, with the help of these fellowships, to get an education and do their part to contribute to the economy. You're not doing that now. You're doing the reverse. Instead of giving the students money, you're sucking money out of them because of these loans that they have to spend the rest of their life paying off. In most European countries, especially accepting England with all that that implies about that other empire's collapse, they don't do that. They don't charge tuition in French, German, and many other Europeans. You don't need to borrow money because there's free education. You know why they do that? Because they're Europeans? No. Because they don't speak English? Not it either. It's because they see an educated workforce as something the society wants to invest in, something the society sees as a good investment because it pays back in the enhanced creativity and the enhanced productivity of those people. Now, yeah, we could imagine that we are the smart ones who know that dismantling higher education, hobbling students with absurd debts, and then hanging them up for the rest of their life, paying the debts off, is some kind of master stroke that these poor Europeans haven't figured out how to do. But if you think like that, you need help. Not the help I can give you, but the help of people who could show you that you've misunderstood how the system works. And you're now in the grip of a political movement that thinks it's clever and smart to be backward economically, backward educationally, because that's all that's happening. You could draw a line as the decline of support for education in the last half century is also the decline of the American economy and the American political power. You should be real nervous about how those things are coordinated because they suggest what you're doing now is going to make matters worse. It's a little bit like watching the tariffs. All the tariffs are doing is teaching every corporation and every country in the world doing business with the United States is way more risky than you thought it was. Because whatever might happen to the taste for whatever you produce, whatever might happen to competition, it's possible in that country to have a president who gets away with changing the terms of your life, your business, at the drop of a hat. Changing them tomorrow, rechanging them day after. The United States is becoming a rogue nation, not in the words, you won't get it, the leaders don't have the courage, but in the reality below the level of the government, of public relations, in every boardroom, they're sitting there trying to figure out, how do we reduce our vulnerability to a society that's falling apart? We used to get the brilliant minds here in the United States, but the brilliant minds around the world who wanted the best education they could get. So they brought their children, particularly the clever ones, to American schools and American universities and colleges. And of course, many of them became used to this country, became used to living here, and stayed here because the doctor you see and the specialist you had referred to are people that are very clearly not what we are used to here in the United States. All of that is now reversing. They're not coming here. It's too dangerous. They don't want an ICE person to jump on them, and they don't want to go where it looks like they're dismantling their education system, and worst of all, seem proud that they're doing it.